easy reader on the Electric Company.
Yeah, and I really was afraid of becoming cast there. If that show had kept going, I might still be there.
If someone told you one of the funniest children's shows ever made was secretly a government-backed reading experiment, you'd probably assume they were exaggerating. They weren't. The Electric Company looked like pure chaos. Funk music, superheroes, comedy sketches, and celebrities. Underneath all of it was one of the most carefully engineered literacy programs ever put on television. Millions of children watched it without realizing their brains were being rewired. The crisis of 1971. It is crazy to think about how a television show could just take over the country and then completely disappear from the face of the earth. But that is exactly what happened with the Electric Company. If you ask anyone who grew up back then in the 70s, they will tell you they loved it. But they probably have no idea why it ended. The year 1971 was a weird time for television anyway. But this project was different because it came from the exact same minds that gave us Sesame Street. The creators had a huge problem on their hands, and they needed a solution fast. They looked at the schools around the country and realized that millions of older children were slipping through the cracks. It was an emergency that nobody was talking about on the news. But the government knew it was a huge disaster. So they put together a team of people to create a show that looked like a wild party, but was actually a deeply planned operation. They hired actors who would later become the biggest stars in the world, though back then, they were just trying to pay their rent. The Mid-Atlantic states and the rest of the country were facing a crisis where 1 in 10 people could not read a basic sentence. The year 1971 was turning into a turning point, because Sesame Street was already 2 years old and doing great things for toddlers. But the older kids were still lost. Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette were the 2 brilliant minds running the children's television workshop. And they could not sleep at night because of this gap. They saw that 3rd graders who fell behind in reading almost never caught up, and their future looked very bad if someone did not step in. The United States Office of Education started a campaign called Right to Read, and they wanted to wipe out this problem completely before the decade was over. The money for the new show was tied up in this big political move, which meant the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The producers were given a clear mission to save the 3rd graders who were currently sitting at the bottom of their classes. These were the kids who felt stupid every time they had to open a book, and they had already built up a strong defense system against anything that felt like school. The show needed to break through that wall by being so funny and so strange that the children would forget they were supposed to be learning. It was a giant gamble, because nothing like this had ever been tried on public television before. And a lot of traditional teachers thought it was a terrible idea. They truly believed that television was the thing that was ruining the minds of young people. So using it as a cure felt like an insult to their profession. The government was so worried about the national reading scores that they threw a lot of money at the project. And even the First Lady, Pat Nixon, got involved in the big push. Yet, no amount of funding could force a defensive 8-year-old to sit still for a lecture. To pull off the impossible, the creators had to build a setup where the last thing you ever felt like you were doing was learning. The Trojan horse strategy. The real magic of the show was that it never felt like a classroom, which was exactly the point. If you were an 8-year-old child who could not read, the last thing you wanted to see when you turned on the television was another teacher with a piece of chalk. You already felt bad about yourself every single day at school, so you would just turn the channel if anything looked like a lesson. The creators knew they had to be sneaky if they wanted to catch these older kids before they gave up on learning entirely. They had to compete with colorful cartoons and loud commercials, which meant the show had to be faster and cooler than anything else on the air. They spent over a year just trying to figure out how to make reading look like a game that anyone could play. The children who watched it thought they were just watching a bunch of funny people acting silly, but they were actually getting a heavy dose of science directly to their brains. The creators did not care about the critics, and they went ahead with their plan to build the ultimate television trap. They knew that if they could make a child laugh, they could make that child pay attention to the letters on the screen. The entire project was designed to be an anti-school experience, which is why they picked the name The Electric Company to make it sound like a rock band or a cool hangout spot. The actors did not look like teachers, but like the groovy people you would see walking around a city in the 70s. The goal was to make the show so attractive that a kid would choose it over a cartoon, even if their friends were watching something else. This meant the comedy had to be top tier, and it had to move at a speed that would keep a distracted 8-year-old glued to the floor. The writers were told to put the jokes first and let the reading lessons sneak in. This created a lot of tension during the planning phases because the educators on the team were terrified that the learning would get lost in all the screaming and running around. It took a long time to find the right balance, and the team spent months fighting over every single sketch. They realized that they could not just guess at what would make a child look at a word. They needed to know the actual physics of how a kid watches a screen. To pull off this massive deception, the producers had to weaponize a brand new field of science: the psycholinguists in the writer's room. To make sure their giant gamble would actually pay off, the workshop brought in a secret weapon that most television shows never even think about hiring. They knew that passion alone would not save millions of struggling readers, so they decided to ground the entire show in deep scientific study. They turned to a brand new field of science and started looking for people who understood how words actually form inside a human brain. They wanted to know exactly why a child looks at a page and sees nothing but confusing shapes, and how they could use a television screen to fix that problem. This brought a whole new group of people into the television studio, and these people did not care about jokes or ratings. They cared about the mechanics of the mind, and they were ready to test every single frame of film before it ever reached a child's house. It was a very serious approach to a very silly show, and this layer of intelligence is the real reason The Electric Company became a masterpiece of design. The producers decided to hire a young graduate student named Barbara Fowles, who was studying a special field called developmental psycholinguistics. This job was all about tracking how children learn language and how their minds connect spoken sounds to written letters. The workshop spent 18 months doing pure research before they ever turned on a single camera, which was completely unheard of at the time. They brought in reading experts, academic advisors, and television writers, and they put them all in one room to fight it out until they had a plan. The big idea they settled on was something called decoding, which is just a fancy word for sounding out letters to discover what word they make. They wanted to teach children the direct link between the print on the screen and the noise coming out of their mouths. This was a huge change from the old ways of teaching reading, which often forced kids to just memorize whole words by sight. The research team found out that struggling readers got stuck because they could not break a word down into its smaller pieces. So the show was built to act like a giant machine that would take words apart and put them back together right in front of your eyes. The meetings between the television writers and the researchers were not easy because they spoke completely different languages. The writers wanted to create wild characters, while the researchers wanted to make sure the letters stayed on the screen long enough for a child to see them. Barbara Fowles and her team had to watch every single draft of the script to make sure it followed the strict rules of their reading plan. If a joke got in the way of the letter sound, the joke had to go, which made the comedy writers very angry. But this fighting is exactly what made the show so strong, because it forced both sides to do their best work. The writers had to become smarter with their comedy, and the scientists had to learn how to relax and let things be funny. The anatomy of a visual magic trick. The visual style of the show became its true calling card. And these bits were so well engineered that they stayed in people's heads for decades. The team discovered that they could use the television screen to animate the actual process of reading, making it look like a physical movement. One of the best examples of this was the famous silhouette bit, which looked incredibly simple but was a work of pure genius. You would see two side profiles of human faces looking at each other in the dark, with one person holding the first half of a word and the other holding the second half. They would take turns making their sounds, moving closer and closer together until the two halves smashed into each other to create a whole word. It turned the boring act of blending sounds into a cool musical duet that kids could copy at home. Another huge success was the way they handled the silent letter at the end of a word. They turned this grammatical rule into a literal stage illusion by creating a character who could change the world just by walking into a room. The silent letter was turned into a song about a character who could turn a cub into a cube or a tub into a tube just by standing at the end of the word. Millions of children found this to be a great way to learn because the show made the letters feel alive. The visual design was elegant because it did not use a teacher's pointer or a textbook-style format. It used bright neon colors, moving shapes, and fun music to show you how a word was built. You did not have to memorize anything because you could see the letters moving around the screen like puzzle pieces. This visual engineering rewired how children thought about language, making them realize that words were just codes that they could easily crack. The show was giving these kids a sense of control over something that had made them feel powerless for years. You would watch a letter glide across a colorful background and dock onto the front of a sentence, and suddenly the entire meaning would change. The producers spent hours adjusting the contrast on the television monitors to ensure that the text was perfectly legible, even on the cheapest black and white television sets of the era. They learned that heavy, blocky fonts with dark outlines worked best for children who had tracking issues with their eyes. Every flash of light and pop sound effect was timed to line up exactly with the pronunciation of a phoneme. It was an incredibly dense layer of graphic production disguised as casual, loose animation. The show was effectively teaching kids how to track lines from left to right, which is the foundational movement of literacy. But brilliant graphics mean nothing without the human element. To bring this to life, the show assembled a crime scene of raw, overqualified talent: the EGOT and the voice of God. The success of these visual tricks depended heavily on the people who were presenting them to the audience. You could have the best research in the world, but if the actors on screen were boring, the kids would just look away. The producers knew they needed a cast that could deliver high-energy comedy without looking like they were trying too hard. They went out and found a group of performers who were so incredibly talented that they killed the roles. They managed to catch several future legends right before they exploded into the mainstream culture, and these actors gave everything they had to the project. They did not treat it like a silly children's gig, but with the same respect they would give to a serious theater production. When you watch the old footage now, your jaw drops because you realize you were being taught to read by some of the greatest artists of our time. The cast was anchored by an actor who would later become known as the literal voice of God in Hollywood. Decades before he starred in major films like The Shawshank Redemption or won an Oscar, Morgan Freeman was a young performer looking for a steady paycheck on public television. He played a character named Easy Reader, who was a super cool, laid-back guy who loved reading so much he could barely contain his excitement. He would walk down the street reading matchbook covers, signs, and newspapers like they were the most interesting things in the world. Morgan Freeman also played a smooth-talking disc jockey named Mel Mounds, and a classic vampire who was absolutely terrified of the alphabet instead of garlic. It is wild to watch him yell about vowels and do silly dances, knowing what a huge star he would eventually become. Right next to him on the set was Rita Moreno, who had already won an Oscar for her incredible performance in the movie West Side Story 10 years before this show started. She was already a certified legend, yet she was up on that screen every day, screaming the famous line, "Hey, you guys," to get kids to pay attention to a reading lesson. She eventually became one of the very few people in history to win an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, which shows you the level of talent they had on a daytime kids show. The early seasons of the show also featured Bill Cosby, whose presence today obviously casts a very long and complicated shadow over the old episodes. But back then, he was one of the biggest names on television, and his involvement gave the show an immediate boost in popularity. The cast also included Judy Grobart, who came straight out of the famous Second City comedy group in Chicago. This incredible gathering of talent meant that every single sketch was performed with maximum effort and skill. The secret hitmakers of PBS. The incredible energy of the actors was fueled by the music, which was another area where the show refused to cut any corners. The producers did not want to use typical children's songs that sounded sweet and boring, because they knew older kids would hate that. They wanted music that sounded like the stuff older teenagers were listening to on the radio, with heavy bass lines, loud horns, and real groove. They wanted the kind of music that would make you want to jump up and dance in your living room, even if the lyrics were just about how to spell a word. To get this sound, they hired some of the best musical minds in the business and gave them the freedom to create actual art. The result was a soundtrack that felt alive and completely changed how educational music was perceived. It was a brilliant move because it made the show feel like a party instead of a chore, and the songs became a huge part of why the lessons stuck in people's heads for so long. The musical driving force of the show was Joe Raposo, who was already famous for creating some of the absolute best songs for Sesame Street. He brought a sense of real musical sophistication to the project and wrote themes that were incredibly catchy, but also technically brilliant. The show's music director was Gary William Friedman, and he was responsible for writing over 60 songs for the series during its run. His biggest contribution to the show's legacy was composing the iconic funky theme song for the Spider-Man segments. He actually sang the lead vocals on that track himself, using a fun fake name, Will Power. The music on the show was real funk and soul, recorded by professional studio musicians who played full arrangements with horn sections and complex rhythms. They made high-quality songs and just pointed them at children. The track that has probably been stuck in your head for 30 years is there because it was good enough to be a hit single on the radio. The writing room was just as packed with genius as the music department, which explains why the jokes seemed so much sharper than anything else on daytime television. A lot of the comedy writers on the staff were young professionals who were just starting their careers but had great potential. Some of these writers would later move on to write for major primetime television hits like MASH and Everybody Loves Raymond. This meant that when a sketch was teaching a child about a consonant blend, the dialogue was written by people who knew how to structure a perfect comedic joke. They treated the language lessons like high-level sketch comedy, ensuring that the parents watching along with their kids would find something to laugh at, too. Even the kids on the show were talented, like a young girl named Irene Cara, who sang in the show's fictional band called The Short Circus. She would later go on to become a massive pop star, who sang the theme songs for hit movies like Fame and Flashdance. The show was operating on multiple levels at the same time, delivering education to the kids and genuine entertainment to the adults. With the best producers, writers, musicians, and actors in America, the show was ready to pull off its most daring stunt yet: weaponizing Spider-Man. The show managed to secure a huge deal with Marvel Comics, which allowed them to bring a legendary superhero onto public television for the very first time. This was a big moment for kids in the 70s because superheroes were not all over television and movies like they are today. Seeing this character in live action on a regular afternoon show was like a dream come true for millions of young fans. The producers knew that this character was the coolest thing they had in their arsenal, and they used him to pull off a brilliant psychological trick. It was a masterpiece of educational design that showed just how far the creators were willing to go to force children to practice their reading skills. They took the most popular hero in the world and turned him into a partner in their war against illiteracy, thus creating a segment that everyone talked about the next day at school. The show introduced the first live-action version of Spider-Man ever to appear on a television screen, played by a talented dancer named Danny Seagren. The budget for these segments was incredibly small, so they could not afford any major special effects or fancy wire work. To save money, they would constantly cut to actual comic book panels right in the middle of a scene to show the action. The absolute best part of this whole setup was a detail that most children never even noticed at the time. This version of Spider-Man never spoke a single word out loud during the entire run of the show. Instead of talking, every single thing Spider-Man wanted to say would appear in a classic comic book word balloon right above his head. If you were a kid sitting at home and you wanted to know what your favorite superhero was thinking, you had no choice but to read the text on the screen. The producers had completely weaponized Spider-Man to force children into practicing their reading skills without them even realizing it. It was a beautifully devious plan because it used pure excitement to break through a child's resistance to books. A kid who would normally throw a textbook across the room would sit there and stare at the television screen, straining to decode Spider-Man's words. The segments usually involved the hero stopping a silly low-stakes villain like the Wall or the Spoiler, and he always won using his wits rather than violence. It proved that you could make reading feel like an essential tool for survival in a cool comic book world. The strategy was an absolute hit, and it became one of the most beloved parts of the entire series. It was a masterpiece of educational design. Comedy versus curriculum. The internal battle at the studio was a constant source of stress for everyone involved, and it points at the difficult balance required to make high-quality educational television. You had a building filled with brilliant comedy writers and actors who wanted to push the boundaries of humor, and a team of researchers whose job was to protect the learning goals. These two groups had completely opposite ideas about how a television show should be done. This created a permanent tug of war over every single line of dialogue and every single camera angle. The performers often felt like they were being held back by the scientists, while the scientists felt like the performers were letting the jokes get in the way of the mission. It was a very real adult conflict happening behind a show that looked like pure, easy fun on the outside. The main problem was that comedy relies entirely on speed, surprise, and perfect timing to work. If you slow down a joke to explain a word, you kill the humor immediately, which was a source of constant torture for actors like Judy Grobart. Teaching a struggling reader requires the exact opposite approach, as these children need extra time and slow movements to process what they are seeing on the screen. The curriculum experts were always telling the actors to slow down and linger on the words, which drove the comedians absolutely crazy. Sometimes, the writers would sneak in complex wordplay that was hilarious to adults but completely useless for a 7-year-old child who could not read. Barbara Fowles later admitted that they made a lot of mistakes by letting jokes pass that were simply too advanced for their target audience. For example, they created a detective character named Fargo North Decoder, which was a fun pun on the state of Fargo, North Dakota. The problem was that a struggling second grader in a big city has absolutely no idea what North Dakota is, so the joke went right over their head. The children who watched the show could feel this high-speed confusion sometimes too. An 11-year-old viewer named Cherie Presley told a reporter back then that while she loved the show, it often moved so fast that she did not have enough time to actually think over the sentences. That is the whole dilemma of the show, captured in the voice of a single child. The very speed and style that made the show cool enough to watch was sometimes the exact thing that left the most vulnerable kids behind in the dark. It was a constant struggle to keep the show from turning into a chaotic mess that failed its primary mission. Despite this internal tug-of-war, the data proved the experiment worked flawlessly, which makes what happened next all the more devastating. Beaten by a plush toy. The impact of the show was tracked very closely by outside groups, and the results were incredibly impressive. In the year 1977, a major report from the Educational Testing Service came out, and it proved that the show was a massive success. The data showed that the program had a clear, positive impact on its primary target group, which was second graders who were sitting in the bottom half of their reading classes. The show had won 2 Emmy Awards, was being broadcast on over 250 public television stations, and was being used as a regular teaching tool in thousands of elementary school classrooms across the country. By every single human standard, the experiment had succeeded in helping children who were falling behind in life. So naturally, the managers decided to shut the whole thing down and turn off the lights. The cancellation of the show was not because it failed its mission, but because of a brutal financial reality that had nothing to do with reading scores. The Children's Television Workshop was a non-profit organization, and they had to figure out a way to keep their company alive during a tough economic period. When it came time to look at the budget and decide which show could generate enough money to support the entire studio, the answer was painfully obvious. They had to look at their 2 biggest properties, Sesame Street and The Electric Company, and see which one was a better business model. Sesame Street had a huge global merchandising empire built around characters like Big Bird, Bert, Ernie, and eventually Elmo. They could sell plush toys, lunchboxes, clothes, and games to parents all over the world, bringing in millions of dollars of pure profit to fund the television production. Our favorite reading show, on the other hand, had absolutely nothing to sell to consumers at Christmas time. You could not easily turn a mute Spider-Man or a middle-aged man who loved reading books into a popular plush toy for a toddler. The show was built for older kids who did not want cute toys, which meant it was completely impossible to monetize in the traditional way. It is a sad thing to realize as an adult that a television program that was actively curing a national literacy crisis was cancelled simply because it was bad at selling plastic merchandise. The long game was won by the accountants and the math, which is how things usually go in the real world of media. The production was halted in the year 1977 after 6 seasons, though the episodes were kept in reruns for several years because schools still needed them. The show was dead, but its legacy survived. It makes you look back at your childhood and wonder, how many of us were successfully tricked into learning by a huge psychological trap we thought was just a party? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.